we can begin for now.
Sounds good.
Yes. So I'll stop sharing my screen and let you share your screen. You can do a quick introduction. So I'll just start with a welcome to DIN TPS meeting. This is where we usually go through a lot of the SSI technology. We always have a guest with us. Today we have Pelle from Notabene. And you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Pelle Brandgaard. I'm Danish, and I am the CEO of Notabene. I've been involved with identity and identity kind of related technology for a long time. I was part of OpenID and OAuth in the very early days, and mainly because I wanted to have a solution to build real applications on, and identity is always like a very important thing to work with. I never actually really wanted to work on identity technology, but it was never there. So I had to work on it. So I'm one of the co-founders of Uport, which is one of the first projects to really try to make decentralized identity practical. And I mean, I'm old enough to remember the early days of OpenID, where OpenID was designed to be a kind of decentralized identity protocol. But of course, now it's used for a bunch of other things, and people would not really call OpenID decentralized nowadays. But that was the original, one of the original reasons behind OpenID. So we found, yeah, go ahead.
This is also, it's a little bit informal, so we'll try to kind of just jump in with questions when there's possible.
Yeah.
So you actually say that OpenID Connect started it came from a decentralized mindset, but it was it ended up into something centralized.
Yeah.
And you do think that now that since we have blockchain, that decentralized way of thought for SSI is possible if you do it correctly, or what your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's. I think the biggest challenge with any kind of identity project is to actually, give the people who we're trying to create identities for a reason to actually control and manage their identity. Yeah. And this is something that us in the identity in the identity industry or whatever, us identirati, as I like to jokingly call ourselves, we have these ideas of this world where everyone really wants to manage and control their own identity, but in reality, the vast majority of people, they don't care, and that's really where it just becomes a tool, an underlying tool to be able to do something. And decentralized identity provides a really, really good framework, but it's not an application in itself. And the way that we see it is that to get decentralized identity out there, or SSI, you need to give people a reason to use it. So at Uport, we were focused on building identity to be able to have to bring an identity construct along with you when you're interacting with Web3 applications. So it was very much focused on Ethereum and tying identity information in a privacy-preserving way to your transactions on the blockchain. This was kind of our initial hypothesis around it, because blockchains are, in theory, self-sovereign. You can have control over your own keys, and you should be able to manage your identity the same way. So that's what we kind of really started with. Of course, since then, decentralized identity has changed a lot. There's a lot of big companies involved with this space now, and I'm seeing somewhat similar kind of things as what happened in the OpenID and OAuth kind of space, where a lot of big companies are just taking it in and just building, OpenID 3.0 or whatever on top of it, for the similar kind of use cases. And you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but as an identity industry, we've been really bad at looking for use cases and actually allowing people to like bring SSI into the business.
Yeah.
So that's where we're coming from with Notabene. So Notabene, we started it about a year or so ago. And rather than being a identity company, and I know we have a .id domain name, and we, but we are really focused on very, very specific business problems and solving them better than anyone else in the industry. Now, behind the scenes, we are using a lot of the decentralized identity technology that we built at Uport in there. However, it is currently, it's kind of hidden behind the scenes. If you're looking at it from a technical point of view, you will see it. Is it fully decentralized or SSI? No, not at all yet. But what we're doing is that we're building the tools into an operation so businesses can eventually start to actually use SSI for real applications. This is just the real problem. One of the things that we saw in Newport is that people look at the technology, businesses look at the tech, oh, this seems really cool, but then actually bringing it in, tying it into a real business or government or whatever use case becomes difficult. So what we're doing is we're focusing on those use cases first and then building them internally using decentralized identity, and then being able to add more user-controlled layers a bit further down. But then it's not difficult to do because the whole architecture is built on it. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the big problems that we're solving, and also kind of. And some of them, you know, I'm probably not going to go in detail on a lot of them, but some of there's this big regulatory thing happening in the crypto industry right now. And what we're seeing is that these particular problems, like DIDs and verifiable credentials, are like kind of really, you know, made for solving these particular things. So what I want to do first is I'll talk a little bit about, actually, let me see, I forgot to put I forgot to like add a quick about slide here, just a sec here, I will.
No problem.
So, you know, live editing here, so, okay. But I just wanted to talk, and feel free to stop me. We got a whole hour, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
So I think I'll probably move over unless there's specific questions on it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about who we are, what the state of crypto compliance is today, because this is the area that we're working in right now. This new global framework that's really affecting everything in the crypto industry today and really making it much more mainstream than it has been in the past. There's a specific rule within the new global framework that called the travel rule, and it's very much related to identity. And so I'll talk a little bit about how, like, the specific identity issues within this, and then I'll talk about some of the open standards that are there. Finally, about how we are trying to solve things, and also how we're using SSI within there. So that's kind of like the overall framing of it. So I will, and yeah, feel free to stop me at any particular time here. Yeah. So what we do is that we help companies manage regulatory and counterparty risk around crypto transactions. And when we talk about counterparties, it's basically if you're performing a transaction, who is on the other side of that transaction. And crypto, it very simply, it could just be I'm sending some Bitcoin to you, Snorter, and then my counterparty risk is that, I mean, the way I'm managing the counterparty risk is that, you know, you sent me a Bitcoin address in a WhatsApp message or something, and I know you, so this is how I know I'm sending this funds to you. But for business, it's a little bit more difficult, and it's a bit more complicated, particularly when you start doing it at scale. So we are Our entire founding team came from Newport, and we are an international organization. And we went live in August with our product. We have quite a few global crypto businesses already as customers, and we are adding a lot all the time. We're basically the market leader in a very, very early space on this. And we're active in all the standards groups and regulatory groups. So we're working directly with regulators and industry to help solve a lot of these cases here. So first of all, to just frame the conversation a little bit. So what I talked about before with a direct Bitcoin transaction, this is like when most people talk about Bitcoin transaction, this is what or crypto transaction, this is what they're talking about. The originator, I'm going to use these are terms that people use in the financial world, originators and beneficiaries. So the originator, the sender, controls a key that allows her to send a transaction to the beneficiary, who also has a key that's able to control those funds. So in this case, this is just individuals, it's peer-to-peer, there's no intermediaries there at all. Now, the reality of things is that depending on certain numbers, probably that certain estimates, probably at least half of all crypto transactions today happen through intermediaries or custodials. So this would be if you're sending funds from, say, Coinbase to Kraken or Binance, but Coinbase and Kraken are essentially custodials. They are intermediaries. They're holding these funds on behalf of you. They hold the keys, and they are managing the whole process. So for a lot of customers, I mean, if you're looking to exchange, you need to typically use a centralized exchange to be able to do this. But also a lot of customers, they don't necessarily feel the urge or need for sovereignty on this particular aspect of it. So they just feel safer that someone else is managing the keys. So this is kind of the area where we come in, because our customers are essentially the exchanges, the intermediaries, the business here.
Yeah.
So to be able to allow wider institutional adoption of blockchain, of crypto in general, one of the big reasons why most banks haven't jumped into this yet is because there hasn't been regulatory clarity around how do we do this? What do we do? And just from a technical point of view, blockchains are really missing information around the counterparty. They're missing the identity layer, and rightly so. You do not want private information on a public blockchain at all. And I think everyone in the identity space can agree with that, even though every now and then we still see projects trying to do that, right? But it's blockchain by design do not have this information on there. So the way current exchanges do this, and if you have a crypto account, you have likely gone through and performed, like they had performed some level of KYC on you. So if you open an account with Coinbase, they've probably taken a selfie of you and you've posted a copy of your passport, something like that, to verify who you are. But the big problem is now, let's say you have $1,000 in your Coinbase account and you're sending it to a blockchain address. Coinbase does not know who's actually on the other side of that transaction. And this is what we're talking about here. We're missing this counterparty information there. And the same when funds get deposited, they don't know where those funds come from. So they can ask their customer. They can also use blockchain analytics, which can help out in some aspects of it. So there are companies like Chainalysis and Elliptic that go in and do a lot of analysis of blockchain transactions to kind of figure out that this address probably belongs to Coinbase, this one probably belongs to Binance, and this one probably belongs to some North Korean hacker group. So So these are the cases these are the tools that companies use today. Like they use this public data, these services who are able to essentially analyze a graph of data on public blockchains to manage risk, but they don't know. So there's really no guarantee that even though your customer, you've been able to verify them completely, that the recipient of that transaction is not a terrorist or a North Korean general. And these are the things that the regulators want companies to deal with. Like every single financial institution in the world, they need to understand who their counterparties are on that, because you cannot, as a bank, send funds to a North Korean general or a terrorist group, or you will receive massive fines. But crypto companies have somehow been able to get around this for a while. So 2019, there's this new regulatory framework or guidelines for crypto that was created by FATF. And FATF is, like I jokingly call them, this is like the actual real, the real little global world government that controls everything. Officially, they're just a group that sets up a bunch of recommendations for how national governments should regulate financial institutions to avoid money laundering. But they have a lot of power. So officially, all they do is they create recommendations. But they were founded about 30 years ago by the OECD to stop money laundering. And so they create these recommendations, but the recommendations also have teeth. So if you get on a gray list or a black list as a country, and if you do not fulfill their recommendations, then you can very easily get on the gray list. And nowadays, the only countries that are on the actual blacklist is Iran and North Korea. But gray list, there's quite a lot of countries that move on and off of that, and it can have serious effects on a business. So it's like on a country's economy. So, for example, if you are in a country that's on the gray list, your banks have more difficulties to perform wire transfers, and all of these kind of things affects your business. So if you export a lot of things from your country, it's going to be more expensive and more difficult for you to export based on this, and also it affects countries' bond rating. So it's a pretty serious set of tools that they have to actually enforce this, even though officially they only issue recommendations. So they just released new guidelines this March, but the original guidelines for crypto were released in 2019. And really, all they're doing is that they're saying that crypto businesses are essentially financial institutions. When I say crypto businesses, anyone really who has custody of someone's funds and helps transfer crypto of some sort. Yeah. So all of these businesses, whether it's Coinbase or I'm not sure what kind of local companies that are in Norway, but all of them are really now seen as a special class of financial institution known as VASPs, or virtual asset service providers. And they have to fulfill basically the same requirements as banks do. And this has been a really big issue for the industry, because a lot of these companies were set up by, freedom-loving, entrepreneurs who don't really want to deal with regulation. Yeah. But this is the main reason they're pushing this is not to stop crypto. It's because they actually see the importance of crypto and blockchain. So the regulators most of the major regulators who actually are behind FATF themselves are actually pro-crypto. And they actually see the benefits to their citizens, to financial stability, all of these kind of things in crypto and blockchain technology. And that's why they just now need to set down some rules. Well, any business that works on top of it, they have to follow the same rules. You're essentially a bank for AML purposes. And this also allows traditional banks to enter the space, and we're seeing that a lot right now. And a lot of this is really one of the reasons why we've seen the crypto prices go up so much over the last 6 months. It's because institutions are joining the space right now. And I think in many respects, I mean, yeah, there are some global macroeconomic reasons for it, but also now pretty much all the banks have projects going. Many of them have products that they want to launch sooner rather than later. And this is one of the reasons for it, because there are now these guidelines. So the original, I'll skip through some of these ones here, but essentially, FATF, they come up with a definition of a virtual asset, or VA, that's used throughout their guidelines, and that's essentially cryptocurrency or token. And a VASP, as I mentioned, is essentially it's a virtual asset service business, so it's essentially a crypto exchange. And the really big issue that has come in is that you now need to understand who your counterparty is. And what they did is, because the crypto industry hasn't really looked at ways of solving this in the past, they said, well, let's look at how banks do this. And they use something called the travel rule, where they exchange information about each other's customers. So it's kind of a collaborative process, if you will, where the originating institution, like if you're sending money from Barclays Bank in London to Citibank in the US, Barclays, they send information around their customer and the beneficiary name to Citibank, and then Citibank verifies that. And so essentially it's a collaborative kind of thing, and this happens through Swift today. And this is not necessarily super compatible with blockchains, and it's definitely not super compatible with SSI, with self-sovereignty necessarily either. But this is what the industry has to solve right now.
Yeah.
And this is what we're working on helping them solve. So just briefly on some of the newer guidelines that just came in, is that it's essentially much, much stricter, and they're applying a very what they call a technology neutral approach to this, which means just because you say something isn't a virtual asset doesn't mean that it isn't. So it's basically, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, as engineers say, it's a duck. And that's the same kind of thing. So if it's something of value that can be transferred, it's likely a virtual asset of some sort. And there's a lot of more guidance dealing with, for example, non-custodial wallets. So this is more a self-sovereign aspect of it. And generally, companies are expected to build compliance into their product. And this is difficult for many of the existing companies who essentially started with zero compliance, and like bit by bit, glued little compliance chunks into it. I'll skip over some of those things, but yeah, one big interesting thing, because I think SSI comes into solutions for some of these things in the future, is that they are now really including DeFi and stablecoins issuers as VASPs as well.
Yeah.
And even though that in theory they may be running on top of a decentralized protocol, the regulators are very well aware that that's likely just what someone on Twitter called the decentralization theater. It's not actually real decentralization. Just because you run some code on a blockchain doesn't mean that there's not a company behind it.
Yeah.
So they issued a big warning shot to the DeFi industry as well to start figuring out solutions for it.
So MakerDAO and Uniswap and everyone just kind of has to think about this now.
Yeah. And a lot of them are already thinking about it, and we're thinking about this before, but there's still, like, crypto Twitter is filled with a bunch of people say, don't these regulators understand that, this is decentralized and whatever, but I mean, literally, one of the biggest exchanges in the world is run by, a VC funded company, in the US. Yeah, it happens to run on top of a blockchain, but the regulators are very aware of that situation and are slightly embarrassed that they've allowed it to happen. So they're trying to find solutions, but they also want to work with the industry for solutions for this, right? They're not trying to say this is how you have to do it. But if the industry doesn't solve it, then they will come up with some part of it here. Now, when it comes to P2P transactions, which is me sending funds directly to you, Snorre. That is, they're really saying that local regulators should just take a risk-based approach to managing it. And risk-based does not mean banning. A lot of people, again, on crypto Twitter, they say, oh, they're trying to ban P2P transactions. They're not. It's just, if I'm sending funds to you, I know who you are. This is not an issue at all. I mean, this is not something that even needs to be regulated. But businesses that are taking funds from a non-custodial wallet, they need to manage some risk around it. And that's really one of the main things that they're talking about here. And again, it doesn't mean they're trying to ban it. They're just saying that certain things tools need to be used to be able to manage risk around it and when we uncover different unknowns on it. And their language, it's always about, these are recommendations, these are things you could and could not do to a local regulator. So the language that you sometimes have to read between the lines. For example, they did say that countries could ban virtual assets, but that wouldn't actually be very helpful. So they kind of hinted at it because they would actually lead to higher risk, money laundering risk, because crypto users of a particular country would just, use offshore providers, and they wouldn't have any way of seeing what's actually happening. So I think it's actually good that the global regulators are essentially encouraging countries to not ban things. Again, judging by crypto Twitter, oh, they're trying to ban everything, all of these kinds of things. It's just not true. So the travel rule, which is where we're primarily working on right now. As I mentioned, this is when one exchange, they send information, or they're performing a transfer to another exchange. So it always starts with the originating customer. So the Coinbase's customer sending funds to a customer at Kraken. And there are a bunch of different responsibilities that different institutions along the payment line they have to do. And generally it boils down to their own customer. They have to verify their identity, and most of them already do this using KYC of some sort. Then you also have to perform due diligence on the counterparty institution. And this is a really important part of it, because you have to trust. So in this case I talked about, Coinbase has to trust that Kraken have actually KYC'd their customer. And since they're also now sharing information from their customer with Kraken, they need to be able to trust Kraken with their customers' data. So these are the two big things that you have to do. Then you have to check names against sanction screening. So this is like the terrorist financing, the terrorist list and crooked government list, kind of that different international groups hold. You need to be able to stop a transaction to going through, and then you need to be able to perform record keeping. This is really what it's about.
It's a lot of steps in the transaction that it's kind of hidden for people. When you be like, I'm just going to send the money over there and that's me, but since we're digital, we don't know that you are you on the other side.
But if you think about it, go ahead.
I wanted to interrupt, and because like in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about, this is how FATS sees it, and then I know what crypto Twitter thinks. But what's this going to look like in 5 years? So an example is like I saw somebody saying that Iran was only allowing the use of like the trading of Bitcoin that had been mined in Iran. So you're getting sort of marked Bitcoin that are Iranian Bitcoin. They're Bitcoin just like any other Bitcoin, but they're certifiedly ethically mined in Iran. That's not going to interact very well with our KYC Bitcoin. So who's going to win this? And what will things look like in 5 years? What are your opinions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think really, I mean, when I talk to regulators, they want the open aspect of crypto, of blockchains, because I mean, if you look at it from their point of view, they've never had tools like Chainalysis ever. So they love the fact, like the investigators, they love Bitcoin. I mean, FBI, everything, I think, I can't remember if it's FBI or DEA or someone like that. There's one of the first investors in Chainalysis. They love it. This is all public data. We don't have to subpoena like 20 banks to figure out what's going on. So they like the public open aspect of it. And they want to minimize there are just a few additional details that they want companies to do, which is like this travel rule aspect for it. You have to manage risk about a lot of different kind of things. So source of, there's a lot of potential things like on Bitcoin, like what you mentioned there, where that may become an issue in the future. This is just all risk that you have to manage. And there's just a bunch of data that you can use to manage risk. But generally speaking, just from our talking with regulators, they're not trying to ban the non-custodial, the open part of it. They're just trying to regulate the business part of it. And if you think about it also, if like, again, some people in crypto try to say, oh, they're just trying to push everything to regulated exchanges. But if they do that, then they're in a worse situation than they're in right now. Then they're basically in the same situation they are with banks, because like I always jokingly used to call banking payment systems as like the real dark net, because it's really, really difficult to trace a payment transaction through and settlement transaction through, and really find out what happens between all the different intermediaries. In the blockchain, you have all of that open. And if you just move everything to like one or two big centralized exchanges, you're no better off than what you have in the banking system. So they don't actually want that. There's a whole other bunch of regulators that are looking at financial stability that also really like the open approaches to things like DeFi, that lets them supervise and actually see the kind of systemic risk that could happen rather than, after the fact, after 2007, 2008, figuring out, oh shit, what the hell happened here, right? They'd be able to monitor those kinds of things up front when DeFi comes out. So generally speaking, the regulators are happy about this. And is it going to be perfect? No, but there's going to be a bunch of different things to deal with. So for example, if you look about counterparty risk, if you're interacting with a DeFi exchange, it's not as simple as the very simple Bitcoin exchange I'm showing here. I mean, it's a Bitcoin transfer here. But if you are exchanging some funds on Uniswap, first of all, who are the parties to that liquidity pool? Who issued the two tokens that are being swapped? So it becomes a really, really complex kind of thing. And then, so I think then also adding it, for Bitcoin, I guess, who mined a particular block. I haven't really thought that much about that specific use case there, but there are a bunch of different data that you need to use. The overall outcome, I think, is better for everyone, because we're going to have a much better financial system, much more open financial system that we have today. But we also have to be careful that it doesn't just become a new, a newer version, a newer, shinier version of what we have today.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, let's skip over some of these things here. The one thing here, I mentioned the vast due diligence aspect here, and this is one area where we are actively using decentralized identity today. And I'll get a little bit into that later, but it's really important to not just it's not just about you verifying your customer. You have to verify who your counterparty institutions that you're interacting with are. And I'll skip over some of those things and get to some of the more interesting bit for this crowd, I think. So one thing that they are saying is that technical solutions must be scalable, secure, and protect data privacy. And I think, decentralized identity is something that can really be used to do this well. And many of the solutions are not necessarily that good for privacy, etc. But I believe we can build good solutions going forward that actually fulfill these requirements. So the travel rule itself has several identity-related challenges to it. So first of all, you have to share this PII. An originating institution has to share this information about their customer. And this is sensitive data. And the way it happens in banking is that I don't think most people realize when they're performing a payment that this happens. It is normally the details behind it is typically hidden in the agreement that you have with the bank. But there's typically not a lot of consent involved with it. But when you're performing a SWIFT transfer, this is what happens. This information gets sent along. And there's a lot of people that the initial instinct is, but what about GDPR and all of these kinds of things? And I think that's a very good question. And GDPR, there are various exceptions. Well, it's not really an exceptions to GDPR, but these kinds of things, if they're covered by the underlying contract an institution has with their customer, then they are allowed to do this, this aspect of it. What they're not allowed to do is just batch export, this is like my 500,000 customer records and then send it to an exchange in the US. They can't do that, but they are allowed to do it when there is a particular transfer that's being requested by a customer. And then you can do that for it. This is what I also showed a little bit before, just expanded a little bit. But there are, in this particular case, you can kind of see, let's see, five different users or 5 different identities, if you will. Like real world identities. There's the originator, there's the originating VASP, there could be an intermediary VASP there, a beneficiary VASP, and finally the beneficiary. And all of these have to perform different checks on each other.
Wasn't that an example of the originating VASP to an intermediary VASP, like a real world example now?
Yeah, so when a exchange uses a custodial service, so there's a lot of different custodial services where that exchange is used to securely manage their keys. They are essentially deemed an intermediary. Kind of a new thing that custodial services are trying to figure out how to deal with this. An example of a custodial service that a lot of VASP use is BitGo, but there are many of them. So essentially, they have an API. You can create, Bitcoin or Ethereum wallets, send funds through them, and they handle the security aspects. But essentially, they are an intermediary. There could potentially be other kinds of intermediaries. FATF has really been, telling the industry it's up to you to figure out who's an intermediary, but custodials are likely intermediaries.
Yeah.
So on the
what about somebody like Tesla? I mean, assuming they had continued to accept Bitcoin or Doge or whatever, does that make them a VASP? How would that fit in?
Yeah, it's a good question. Now they are not a payment institution, but there are some requirements that you have when you sell luxury products, and different countries have different rules for it. But if you are if you're making if you're buying $100,000 car, typically the car dealer has to make a record of it. And particularly if you come in with a suitcase full of cash, then they do have to report that typically. So It hasn't gone to that level yet here, but likely. It's generally speaking, if you're a business, you should know who you're doing business with, and that Amazon knows who you are when you're buying something from them, and a car company would know that as well. So it's not, they don't necessarily need to know this for AML purposes, but similar kind of rules could come here as for people who are buying luxury items with cash, because there are definitely rules for that, and I would expect that to apply here as well.
So they're not a VASP because they won't handle anything for you. They just receive. They're just a beneficiary in this.
Yeah. And as I mentioned,
you ask for a refund.
Yeah.
And then they have to trade. So they essentially they become almost like an exchange at that scale. And then so then the question becomes, at what level can you accept this will, like if you were looking to adopt crypto as a payment method or a payment service, then you would, like, this framework would, I guess, impede the adoption of something like that. So I'm curious about, like, things like, for example, like the Lightning Network, how that would work, and also today, like, many mixing services are heavily frowned upon, and if you run one, then you will get caught and you will be put in jail. But you get, I guess, Monero and potentially also, I guess, with maybe with Lightning and with upcoming changes to Bitcoin, we might see a sort of mixing becoming part of the protocol, as in like that mixing will be like by default, not as something that you would do in order to maintain privacy, but just, it's cheaper because by combining multiple transactions. So then, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out and what regulators will.
I mean, I think first of all, if, like, most businesses are not going to just handle their own wallet, they're going to use some kind of custodial service, and they're now the ones that have that requirement. It's like, again, most businesses today, I think in Scandinavia, for example, I mean, I don't know about Norway, but at least in Denmark and Sweden, not that many people use cash anymore. So it's the same kind of thing. You're essentially outsourcing that to another institution, while theoretically you could accept cash. Most people aren't, and in e-commerce, no one accepts cash anyway. Everyone uses some kind of service provider there. So I think actually what this does is it actually can bring more transactions to crypto, because it gives you this layer, this counterparty layer. This counterparty layer is needed for e-commerce, for example. I think one of the main reasons, besides the price volatility, that people aren't using crypto as much nowadays is, or they're not using it for e-commerce, that the different companies that offer solutions, why it hasn't really taken off, is that there isn't this counterparty layer that you need. And you do need that for e-commerce. Like, if you are selling something, you need to, if you're buying something with Amazon, you want it to show up that, oh, you paid Amazon and not North Korean jean company number 2 or whatever, right? You want to know that you've actually sent the correct payment, and then they need that information also, so they can prove that you're the one, you sent that payment, and now they can send you the goods. So it's just, for day-to-day business, you need to know who your counterparties are. And the crypto industry has not really looked at solving this, which is why I think most of the use cases are in the investment kind of use case now, where it may not be that important. Now, when it comes to things like mixers are for sure considered VASPs, and you can run a VASP. You can run a mixer if you identify who your customers are. Then you can legally do this in the US. And what they've gone after several big mixers in the US recently, and they've received large fines, that they may even be jailed into them. I haven't really followed it closely, but they've gone after VASP because they are literally money laundering. I mean, they're mixers because they are. I mean, this is the whole purpose of a mixer in the way that they're selling it. So the way the regulators are looking at it is that they are money service businesses. There may be a really good reason to have someone to break the payment trail on a public blockchain, but it can't be for money laundering purposes. So there are great reasons why you want to use, privacy coins and all of these different kinds of things. But if you as a business are operating this, you need to identify the customers because you are quite literally the definition of a money transmitter. And they will go after you, and they will, likely throw you in jail if you run these kinds of services without performing KYC. And of course, this goes against the whole idea of mixers. I mean, I've been part of the crypto industry for a long time, and the idea of having a regulated mixer, like if you come from like an OG Bitcoin person like me, that sounds like horrific. But if you come from the point of view that a regular user is just trying to hide the transaction history from the rest of the world, then that's not necessarily that, there's still use cases for it. And I think this is where like the payment networks the regulators are trying to figure out how to deal with them. But in most cases, the way by default, if you are a business and you're helping transmit funds, you are likely a VASP. And that means if you were running a Lightning node, in theory, or any other kind of layer 2 node, in theory, you are a money service business. And at least under US rules, and that means that you likely have to perform KYC and all of these kinds of things, or limit the transaction sizes. And that's what we're seeing some companies do.
It sounds sort of hard to imagine, like some startup might pitch like, oh, so we're this privacy maintaining mixer service, and all you have to do is you have to send us your crypto coins and your passport so that we can know who you are. So
yeah,
I mean I understand where it's coming from, and I also think that in the world that you're describing, we're going to see essentially a ban on cryptocurrencies without like an audit trail, because that's more or less what's being demanded.
Yeah, I mean, I think all cryptocurrencies will have an audit trail, but not all of them will have a straight. I mean, they're the privacy coins. They still have an audit trail of some sort in there. And I think actually having a payment messaging layer separate, a privacy preserving payment messaging layer as what's needed for the travel rule is one of the things that can actually give the regulator some, actually make them feel happy with these privacy preserving things. Because if I'm sending from one business to the other, I can provide complete proof of all of that. I have all the records. I can manage my risk completely. So if they want to understand who's behind it, they can come with a subpoena to me as a business, and I have the records to be able to do that. Also, by the way, when we're talking about these legal mixers, pretty much everyone in the crypto space already use these legal mixers, like they're called crypto exchanges, because essentially if you send funds into Coinbase, your money gets mixed in between everyone else's money in Coinbase. And it's really one of the easiest way to protect your public track record. Like I never share any of my non-custodial wallet addresses publicly anywhere. Unless I move it through some kind of exchange as a way of protecting this. So this is another part of it. No one likes the idea of an institution being a mixer, but institutions are part of actually helping maintain privacy here for people in the blockchain world as well.
That's a very good point.
Cool.
So very briefly, so I mentioned here, you need to be able to understand who the VASP is on the other side of a transaction. There are a couple of protocols. There are several protocols on the space. There's one called OpenVASP that is, it's a really interesting approach, and we've been able to push them into start using DIDs throughout it. it still isn't fully live yet, and there's a lot of reasons that it's difficult for a lot of businesses to implement. But this is kind of what we think would be a good way of pushing the industry, because it's privacy preserving. It's based again on these decentralized identifiers. It uses, instead of using blockchain addresses, it uses what's known as a virtual asset account number, which identifies a account at an exchange. And this allows you to give an account number to someone without them being able to trace your account history. So there's a lot of privacy benefits to users there. Of course, this is primarily for using, when you're using custodial services like exchanges. And yeah, so all the exchanges there's a built-in concept of a VASP code, an identifier for exchanges. And it's very similar to a SWIFT code in banking. And they have this concept of a VAN number, as I mentioned, which is similar to an IBAN code. And with this, you can verify that, like, if I'm trying to send funds to this particular VAN number, it's just as easy as sending it to an IBAN number in banking today. And it helps solve a lot of these issues that people have for sending funds today using crypto. I mean, I've been in the blockchain space since 2010 or 11 or something like that. I'm still scared every time I enter a blockchain address into withdrawal screen of either an exchange or one of my wallets. So it's like this leap of faith that you have to do. Is this actually mine? Did anyone intercept it? And this can really help make things usable for the greater, for the less crypto savvy people, and even people like me who are crypto savvy and just are always scared. So there's a data message format called IBMS 101, and this is very similar to, there's a family of SWIFT messages for exchanging this information. So the industry worked together, and this is like the only real standard yet in the space. And essentially, it's a standard around a data model, as well as, for example, a JSON representation for it. But it's not, there's no flow in it. There's nothing else in there. It's not designed around DIDs or VCs, but you can easily build it into a VC model, for example, like verifiable credential model. And we do that in our implementation of it.
Would a JSON, does JSON LD benefit in this context?
Well, I'm not a fan of JSON LD. I think there are many security issues in there. Maybe it could be, but I don't see a specific benefit in there, because it should really be as simple as possible. Yeah. And JSON LD just starts including a whole bunch of unrelated dependencies into something. And when you're dealing with payments, you want as few external dependencies as possible. Yeah. Which is why I'm not a fan of JSON LD. I was not a fan of XML signature, which has many of the similar kind of approaches to JSON LD. And Swift is based on XML signatures, by the way. So, I mean, but I don't think they use much of the linked data stuff within it. So what we do at Notabene is, I already talked about this problem that people don't know who they're interacting with. So really what we do is we help businesses not figure out who's behind every single transaction on the blockchain. That's not our job, but we help our customers, who are, as I mentioned, are primarily exchanges, understand who's on the other side of the transactions that they do, that they're working with. So we do this through travel rule, but we also do it for what the regulators can call unhosted wallets, or what the crypto industry calls non-custodial wallets, like traditional crypto wallets. So we have this all-in-one platform. It's a typical kind of B2B SaaS platform. So there's API, there's a dashboard. There are some aspects that can get implemented in and embedded into your site as an exchange to help some of the data gathering aspects of it. And most of our customers have never heard of DIDs, have never heard of verifiable credentials. And at the moment, I think we like it that way, because that's just a whole nother, they're stressed trying to figure out how to deal with the regulator. They don't need to understand a whole new bunch of technology, even though that technology is behind the scenes. So the way that we use DIDs is just internally in our platform is that every exchange has a DID, and there's a bunch of verifiable credentials that come from different sources around them, and these are then used to perform know your VASP or due diligence on each other. Some of this data is public and some of it is private, and you go through a more of a selective disclosure-like approach where you are requesting information from an exchange, and you are I actually have a client call in 1 minute exactly. I didn't realize we were this late, but yeah, I mean, this is high level. I can share. I'm happy to share these slides afterward. Yeah, that's pretty much where we are. We're also doing some interesting things where we're starting to add self-sovereignty into it with a new blockchain called Concordium, and we're working on some new things in the future on that. But I'll share the slides on this.
Absolutely. But thanks a lot for showing up. And even if we got to DIDs a little bit late, but it's interesting to see how much complexity can be out there and still be solved with the DIDs and VCs. That's an important factor. It's really interesting. You have to go to a client, so we can have a discussion afterwards if everyone wants to stay. But really, thanks for showing up, Pelle. It's always great to see you, and I hope that we will cross our paths at some point.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for your questions.
Have a good day. Bye. Yes, any questions, guys? Any thoughts you want to discuss?
I have a lot of thoughts, as always.
Yeah, I love to spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes to just discuss them, and then we can potentially also bring them along to Pelle afterwards, because we're still recording, so we can bring them along to him, and he can do a written response if need be.
Yeah. I mean, it's very eye-opening, and it's very interesting to see what regulators are moving towards. An idea I had at the end there was that if exchanges are issuing sort of selectively information about their customers when transferring from one exchange to another, potentially you could also get like a receipt from the exchange, so like a signed statement saying, that the withdrawal was made by such and such person and on such and such date, and that would be, I guess, your permission slip to introduce these back into the a regulated exchange at a later time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a little, maybe unconventional, and like I think it might need some resistance on from some people on Twitter and stuff like that. I mean, it's a little bit of the like at least with Bitcoin, one of the goals was to have a censorship resistant network, and this is basically adding like a permission layer to it. So I've thought a lot about whether, in the future, will we have 2 Bitcoins or maybe even 3, as in like they're all the same Bitcoins, but one operates within like Iran, one operates outside of a legal framework, and one operates with the accompanied permission slips.
Yeah. But like in terms of this receipt, how would you see that will benefit anyone?
You could make it. You could ban the use of, cryptocurrency without proof of origin. So you could if you want to do self custody, then you would have to get a essentially like a signed statement saying who you are, so that you can prove that that wallet belongs to you when you want to spend from that wallet, because they're not going to let you reintroduce this into the I mean, above maybe a threshold value. It's not going to be able. You're not going to be able to reintroduce it because you don't have like an audit trail, I guess.
Yeah. But like, if you do transaction on a blockchain, isn't that a receipt in itself, or is it like you need a receipt of the counterparty, as Pelle talked about?
If you just have I don't know, an address to refer to, then there's no identity tied to that. So the point is, like say for example that you want to buy a Tesla, and you have funds from a wallet, then they're going to ask you, well, where did that wallet come from? And then you would point. So it's sort of, I see this as like a point where it's getting pulled in two directions. One is that it will continue to operate, the way things are today, and then the other one is that we're getting more and more regulated in terms of, I don't know, like banning anything that doesn't go through regulated exchange. How?
I think this is where DIDs and VCs can be very powerful, though. Like, because as you see how DIDs is supposed to work as an identifier, how VCs are supposed to work as verifiable credentials, and where you have an issuer that can issue something that's so you can say, hey, I've been accepted. And then it's just how do you link that potential crypto address with this DID and interlink that technology so that you can when you do a payment, there could be like this receipt service that basically says, okay, this address also holds this DID, and then that DID has its a service endpoint saying, hey, I have my verifiable credentials, public things right here, so you can see that I'm actually verified from the right institute, and then you do the whole tree nesting down as verifiable credentials and SSI now allow, but you need to have some type of decentralized mechanism so that all these things can be looked up in a manner that works, and that's where the SSI space tries to build up simple secure data storage APIs, issuer and verifier APIs, so that the real world can work with these endpoints and put it into the processes, as we kind of saw that Pelle and Notabene is trying to do, where they're actually giving everyone a DID, and when everyone has this identifier, they have a lookup point, they have a resolving mechanism, so they can be identified cryptographically and can provide more data about themselves.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thought. Or I just kind of, based on what you were saying, that kind of just made a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant. So one things that would come up is, how would you, like, where would you store it, and it would sort of be the burden of the person wanting to prove the audit trail to figure out, a way to store such an audit trail, or like we saw on the slide, you could have exchanges that communicate with each other, and then I guess they both store it.
Yeah, but if everyone is if everyone kind of resolves around DIDs, and DIDs have that agent endpoint, which follows some standards of communication, like a DID-COM. Then you can start to see, okay, well, as long as you have a DID, I will be able to get the message to you without having to talk all this API stuff that we kind of do struggle with today. But if we're able to say, okay, I'm resolving a DID, that DID is, I hope to find some type of communication mechanism there, and then I can send this envelope to that post box and get a response of some sort. Because when I send this envelope, they have my DID, and they can do the same mechanism other way around, and then everything is tied down to cryptographical keys, and you're able to start exchanging more data, basically.
Another thought I had was maybe banks are fairly good at saving and protecting customer data. At least I can't really or I'm sure there's somebody will come up with an example that disproves the argument. But there aren't that many leaks from banks that have had their entire customer base leaked and all transactions associated with that customer. But we've seen that with crypto exchanges, and we see that with more or less any normal shop, whether it be like a pizza place or a car dealership, the data will eventually leak. So then the question becomes, how do you, is that going to be an issue for people? What are the risks? Like how will it's not necessarily a problem for maybe, but it's an added risk that you're guarding over personal data that makes you liable for.
Yeah, but that's where, like, if let's say this pizza shop has a simple way of saying, okay, we got encrypted data stores that's connected to every person coming in and connecting themselves with us through their DID, so that they don't necessarily host it and manage it themselves, but they got, okay, we don't, everything that stores is being stored on our side is basically encrypted, and because we have DIDs, we have keys in the outer edges of the network, and then you can talk a lot more encrypted end-to-end situations, which will allow us for better privacy and avoid these leaks of data potentially. In my mind, but it's a difficult road. There's a long path until we get there, but I do think that at least enabling by using DIDs, you enable keys in the leaf end of sides. Also, blockchain is keys at the outer edges of the network, and then that can play out some really interesting capabilities, such as encryption, encrypted storage, and these kind of things.
You also gain, or like in such a world, you can potentially extend know your customer from a trusted sort of authority. So maybe you won't have to send a picture of your passport to everyone if you had this system in place, because if you, for example, if you go through a regulated exchange, then you can identify at a different regulated exchange, and they could potentially trust that you are you, since they can pass on the verification.
Yeah, and that's what one hope with verifiable credentials. And what I talk about is usually with government in Norway here is that, well, you want the government to be at least put some regulation, and by what instead of them coming with centralized services and databases, they can come with lists of trustworthy actors, issuers, so that you as again, you want to trust certain data points that people come to you. You just check the list with the government. Okay, yeah, these issuers have been vetted and accepted, so they can we can trust the data coming from there. They're issuing the right they're issuing based on the right regulations, and they're issuing the right type of data. But the government, they don't host software; they just do lists and data models. They build up a data model of what is this type of data, this verification going to look like, and then they set a list of these people. These are software providers are able to issue this data, and then you can let all these other people who can verify just check that list and see, oh, this data comes from there and it's the right type of data. So that's the what you were just talking about. How I see DIDs and VCs will potentially break out this forever loop of API connections that will never end.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. And it raises the question about should and will and when will the government issue a like should they do it, or should a private company issue a digital key, a credential?
Yeah, that comes down to regulations. Like, is Notabene able to follow the compliance of these OWASP and all these kind of things? Okay, then we'll allow Notabene to do the issuance. And then
the government already does the issuance because they issue the passport, which you use to prove your identity to the exchange. So
yeah, but what could have been done is that, okay, the government just defines the passport data model, and then they say, okay, if you follow these compliance, you're able to issue this credential.
Yeah.
So it could actually happen outside of the scope, as long as they follow the compliance. They can just say, okay, the only service who can do this is the police, and the police can issue a passport, but it's still going to be quick and easy because it's all digital and following the data model, and everyone knows the police is DID. So it will be easy for us to trust this digital passport coming, because it's coming from the Norwegian police that we know the data about. Yes.
It sounds very easy, but good luck telling them to implement this.
Well, that's why we're here. We make information about how easy it can be, so we can start throwing money at the problem. I talked to FHI recently.
Yeah.
And they're not going to do anything with SSI for the current vaccination passport they tried to, or Corona certificate, because they don't have time, because they need to deliver something now. But Germany, who I've been talking about, who really pushes SSI, they've really organized themselves well. We're the ones that pushing hard on this in the EU. Like, hey, if we do it this way, it can be really good. If we do the SSI way, it can be really, really good, really flexible and good. And they kind of showcase a lot of good solutions.
Yeah.
But they didn't. The EU didn't jump on it now because it's so time pressing.
Yeah.
But it just showcases that, hey, there's a lot of movement, a lot of big forces pushing this, and a lot of people trying to say, hey, if you just do it this way, we will get a lot of benefits. So it's just a matter of time, and just continue pushing this information gateway, basically, so that we can hopefully get research and other governmental funding into this problem.
I think somebody posted a link to, or somewhere I saw, like, the standard for the vaccination, which was like it was your name, your date of birth, and then what kind of vaccine, and then like a signature of somebody, and then all as a QR code.
Yeah.
But probably not following the standard. But it raises, it got me thinking. It raises a lot of interesting, like, so it depends on. It gives like if that were adopted by businesses in order to let people in or not, then you're also giving them your name and your like a unique identifier that they can use to track you across different places. And also it doesn't say anything about your picture, so it needs to be accompanied by some sort of like tie between your name and your, I don't know, biometrics or your. Yeah.
And now we're going to a very heavy B nest.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But yeah, it's complicated, and but I think that we will get there at some point. It's just gonna take some time, but I believe that we are going in the right direction. And we just need to keep learning ourselves, teaching ourselves these things, so we can build the right solution going forward. Well, good. I gotta end the meeting now because I have another one coming up. But it's always good to have discussions, and thanks for staying on, Espen. And hope to see you next time with IOTA on 31st. And everyone else, of course, thanks for coming, but I give Espen some creds for keeping the discussion going.
Thanks for the initiative and for hosting this. It's really interesting. It's kind of hard to figure out what to do about it, like how to make it actionable into something that can. But it's really interesting to see which.
There's people doing it.
Yeah. I know. So mad. Yeah.
We'll find a way.
Yeah.
Perfect. But have a good day, guys, and thanks for showing up. Later.
Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.